Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Teach Access Student Academy. My name is Mindy Colin. I am the Director of Development and Industry Partnerships, and we are so glad that you're here. If you've been with us the entire day, thank you. If you're watching this on replay, we know you'll get a lot of wonderful information from the content that all of our presenters have been sharing. We're going to review a few things before we get into the session. Let's see. Okay. So we are committed to making this event accessible. You can turn on captions by using the CC button in your Zoom toolbar. American Sign Language ASL interpretation is available during the sessions, and the interpreters are spotlit the entire time so that they show up on our recordings afterwards. And if you need any other help during the session, the chat feature is off, but you can message the hosts through the chat. You won't be able to have ongoing conversation with other attendees, but you can message us to let us know if you have any questions or need anything. We invite you to engage in this session. You can participate in the chat if we open it up, and we will let you know if it becomes available. There is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we invite you to put any questions that you might have for the presenter in the Q&A feature. We invite you to take notes or not to take notes. Quiet listening counts too, so if you like to just sit back and listen, by all means, we do encourage that. And of course, feel free to step away, stretch, or take breaks as needed. We'd like to thank our project team who has helped organize this event. Deanna, Ian, Ruth, Jennifer, Lexi, and Sherry been an integral part of putting this together for everyone. And a thank you to our sponsors for making this event free for everyone to attend. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, Microsoft, to ADP, Google, Meta, Salesforce, and Skyscanner. Let me stop sharing. Thank you. Okay. So at this point, I want to introduce you to our presenter, Whitney Quesenbery. Hi, Whitney. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Yeah. So let me just read your bio for everyone. Whitney Quesenbery is the co-founder and chief program officer of the Center for Civic Design, working with election offices and good government advocates to improve the voter experience and make it easier for everyone to participate in elections. She brings a fascination with people, an obsession with communicating clearly, and a belief that people are at the center of the creative process of all of her work. She is the author with Sarah Horton of A Web for Everyone, Designing Accessible User Experiences, published by Rosenfield Media. The book introduced principles of usable accessibility and a set of personas illustrating the impact on people with disabilities. Her other books are Storytelling for User Experience and Global UX Design and Research in a Connected World. Before elections and before her work in user experience, she was a theatrical lighting designer, learning about storytelling from the masters. She holds a Master's of Social Research Methods from the Open University, and you can follow her on LinkedIn. Welcome, Whitney. I will turn this over to you.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. This is the one I want. I am so happy to be here with all of you guys. Love this program. And what we're going to be talking today is about how to use personas, which is a user experience technique, to design for differences. There is a tiny URL on the screen, and it is tinyurl.com/ all lowercase MR3SWTFN. That will take you to a folder that has this presentation and all of the resources I'm going to mention if you want to look at them. I know some people like to have the slides to follow along, but if you want them later, they're there as well in Google Slides. A little bit about me, just a description. I'm an older white woman with short gray hair, red eyeglasses. Took me years to be a person who would wear red eyeglasses instead of just being someone who wanted to wear red eyeglasses. I work at the Center for Civic Design. We're a nonprofit focused on theater. I'm sorry, focused on theater. I used to be focused on theater, focused on elections. And part of why the connection here is that elections are one of the places where accessibility is taken quite seriously. I served on a federal advisory committee for usability and accessibility in voting systems and kind of had a very deep dive through thinking about all the things that election has to do, from the kiosk-like voting systems to the information and websites that help people know how and where to vote. We were founded in 2013, just about the time the book A Web for Everyone came out. And our mission is to invite everyone to participate in elections and democracy by bridging the gap between the complexities of government and the needs of people, which is as broad as I could possibly make it to say we want to make sure that everybody can vote. I am also really a fan of personas as a way to keep people in mind throughout the design process because it's so easy just to dive into your own world about that and not think about people even when you mean to. So what we're going to do today is in kind of three acts. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about what personas are. And then we're going to go around to the back end and talk about ways to use them, and then come back to think about how you choose and create useful personas for your own project. I'm going to take a brief pause for any questions between those three. You'll see these dark blue slides come up as a cue that we're going to take a little pause for a minute. And that way, if you're not understanding something or just have a question to interpret something better, before we move on to the next section of the conversation, you'll have a chance to do that. So we'll start with what are personas, and what are they good for? Minnie mentioned that one of the things we include in the book, A Web for Everyone, is a set of principles for accessible usability. And principle one is people, right? We call it people first and designing for differences. The point here is that if you are not designing with the needs of the audience in mind, you're designing for yourself because inevitably you focus on the people around you or your own impressions. And so one of the hardest things to do is to remember the great variety of people who might come to a project that we're working on or a product we're working on. I'm going to say project because it's a little broader and I can keep that shorter. But the bottom line of this, of course, is that you simply have to know your audience. And personas are one of the ways not to learn about your audience, but to document what you've learned, to have a shared vocabulary within your team about who you think you're serving. And of course, people with disabilities are easy to forget if they're not visible in your work environment. No small set of personas can represent the entire world of people, let alone the entire world of people with disabilities. But it's also important to remember that a person with a disability is first a person, right? With their likes and wants and preferences and habits, and whether they're a fast user or a slow user, whether they're easily frustrated or very patient. So one of the things that personas let us do is combine research, what we know about our audience, demographic and behavioral data, into a story that represents different types of people. When we get to the third part, we'll talk about how you choose the people you're going to represent to help you work on your project. But it's a way of taking a lot of different pieces of information and putting it together into a hopefully engaging container. There's 8 people represented on this slide, and they are the 8 personas we wrote for the book, A Web for Everyone. I'm not going to introduce all of them, but I'm going to talk about some of the overview of who they are. They were all people who used the web for both personal and professional use. We thought this was important because the book was about users of the web. There's a whole another book to be written about the digital divide and who has access to certain kinds of information. But we were assuming that what we were writing for was how to design for people who are already using the web. The other is that we based them on statistics. So we started by thinking about not only big national statistics or international statistics, but also our direct research experience, people we knew, people we'd worked with. We did some learning by reading from or talking to nonprofits who represented and do research for people with different kinds of disabilities. So as you look at the picture, I'll do a quick introduction to them. We have Leah in blue in the top left corner. She's a woman leaning on her arm and kind of staring at a screen. Next to her is Carol, who's an older woman with white hair with a nice cat on her lap, and she's actually reading a book. Next to her is Jacob, who has glasses on and is using a braille note. If you can see that closely on a small screen. So he's blind. We have Stephen, who has some graphic design tools on his table, but appears to be looking at his phone and signing. We have Maria, who is sitting at a table with a group of people around her with a tablet in front of her. We have Trevor, who also is working on a tablet that seems to have a very simple screen and has some pencils lined up in front of him just perfectly so he can grab them when he needs them. We have Emily, who is using a power wheelchair and also has a service dog with her and a backpack. She looks kind of casually dressed, maybe a student. And then we have Vishnu, who's sitting in front of some technical equipment. It's very deliberately not very detailed, but one thing that you can see is that his keyboard has large print letters on it. So let's just take a moment and think about this quietly. How many different types of differences do they represent? As you just look at these 8 pictures or think about my description of them, what are you seeing? And maybe what are you not seeing? So just take a second on that. And can I see the chat if you put things in it? I think I can. If you have some ideas, why don't you just drop them in that chat? Give you a second for that, and then I'll talk about the things that we were trying to wrap into them. Okay, so different tools in different environments, at least 5 visible disabilities, but a couple of invisible disabilities as well. We were also thinking about age, so we actually assigned ages to these characters to go from 18 to 74, 75, just because we wanted to make sure that all ages of life were represented. We also included Maria as a Spanish speaker, and so we included someone whose English is not their first language. So you can see that there's a lot of richness and complexity baked into those, the idea of how those personas fit together, even though, of course, there's many, many more types of people and many, many more types of disabilities than they represent. Okay, so let's look at one in particular. Let's look at Leah. And I love her because she has an invisible disability, which is that she's got fibromyalgia, so she's living with fatigue and pain. And she was partly informed by the fact that we knew a lot of technical writers, and there's a lot of writers were early work at home people, often because of difficulty sustaining a long day in the office. So we also wanted to think about behaviors. So the first thing we did was think, what are the statistics? And in the book, these are all citations, but there are some 5 million people with fibromyalgia. And by the way, 80 to 90% are women, which is why Leah is female. We thought about what the conditions were and some of the other medical conditions you might have that are similar to the one we gave her. We then took from a bit of research that Dana Chisnell and Ginny Reddish did. They'd come up with these 4 characteristics for personas, and that they should represent your ability, your aptitude, and your attitude. And then we added assistive technology to it. So your ability in this case might be simply your level of or ability, or what things affect your ability. But it also could include, in a more broad sense, how good you are at using a computer, how good you are at other aspects of tasks that you'd be using this product for. We looked at her aptitude, which is sort of how eager, how not eager are they? Are they someone who brings a lot of experience, or someone new, both to computers or the web, but also to the domain or the sector of the content itself. And when we look at attitude, we thought about patience and impatience. We thought about persistence. We thought about frustration. And we began to think about what Leah would think one of her big attitudes was in terms of what she might want to communicate about her disability. In this case, that she wishes people would understand just how hard it can be to make it through the day. And then we looked at the kinds of assistive technology she might use. She has a split keyboard. She's also a power keyboard user, and she's got headphones on, which right now we would all think, oh, she's just on Zoom, but actually she's wearing them because she's a Dragon naturally speaking user. So she's using dictation to reduce the amount of physical work it takes her to type. So all of these help us get a picture of the kinds of things that affect Leah, but they don't spell it out, and they don't tell us much about her as a person. So the second step of a persona is to bring in the rest of the person. As I said, we gave them an age. So Leah's our mid-age person at 35. We gave her an advanced degree, and we gave her a job writing for a trade publication and working from home. Right. So we now know that she's on her own computer, that if she has a problem, there's no tech IT person to come help her, and so on. And we gave her a short story. I've had to summarize it for space, but she began feeling numbness in her hands and fatigue. Finally, she had to make a change in her work, and she managed to find a job where she could work from home and on her own schedule, so she could have breaks during the day, and she could get work around her good days and her bad days. We gave her a new keyboard and a trackball and some of the things that we learned people used for assistive technology. And we gave her a quote that came from some people we talked to, which is that I'm lucky that my boss that my company understands that this really is a disability, right? So we sort of highlighted some of her challenges, but also some of the solutions that get through the challenges. The last thing I want to talk about is the picture. We worked really hard on these. We started with sort of photographs of people, but those were too specific. And so we worked with a graphic designer to create the image so that we could highlight those key features and give those pictures a little bit of emotion. And we also vetted them. We got people to look at them. In some cases, people told us about details we had wrong. My example was that Emily, who has both a power wheelchair and a dog, the way she was drawn had her dog's leash on the same side of her wheelchair as her power controls. And they went, oh no, you can't possibly do that. What happens when the dog jerks the leash and sends the wheelchair zooming? Right. So we really tried to make sure that we represented in small ways those details, not to call them out specifically, but just to give the persona a full rounded view that if somebody who was similar to one of the personas looked at it, they would say, oh yes, they get me. So so just to sum it up, we created these persons thinking of a range of ability, thinking across the disability spectrum. We looked at behaviors and how they interact with the web by control, choices about how they work, and we included attitudes and emotions. I think that these stories are actually the key to personas, right? Because they bridge a gap between the world out there, the audience out there, and what we know in our room, in our circle, in our team as we're working on something by putting a human face on dry data and technical requirements. So often when people ask me about accessibility issues, what they say is WCAG 2.4.7.3 or the voting system guideline number, what's this requirement mean? But the reason why they're confused about it is usually not because the requirement isn't clear if you understand accessibility, but because they don't have a connection between that requirement and why it exists. So pause now for a couple of questions. If anybody has one, you can drop it in the Q&A. Sorry, mid-age, I see the chat in here. Mid-age is the middle of our spectrum, not middle-aged. But if you have questions, drop them in, and someone will let me know that they're there. If not, let's move on to how do we use personas? Because having written them, we have to do something with them. There are two ways you could think about disability and personas. This is partly a question of the maturity of your team or the degree of education about accessibility about your team. If you're introducing accessibility to a team as a new thing, we wrote these personas for you. They're a starting point where you can say, here's 8, let's think about them, let's learn about them a little bit, but also um, let's think about how they work in relationship to our particular project. You can focus on behaviors or what their assistive technology needs might mean, and you can simply have them as a standalone kind of exploration tool, not so much a teaching tool, but an exploration tool to connect your disability needs into that broader audience you're working for, and to connect project features and goals to people with disabilities specifically. But if your team is a little further along and kind of gets it about accessibility, then you can begin to think, okay, how do we integrate the kinds of behaviors and the kinds of needs that that people with disabilities have into more general personas? And that's why we gave people a job and a work and didn't make them simply about their persona, because Emily is a student in our story and has to, get back and forth to school. Leah is a writer, is working at home at the computer all day. So we can think about how those kinds of jobs, and if those don't work for your audience, then you can begin to think about where disabilities would amplify the range of the personas that you've created. And now we can begin to focus on not just someone with a disability, but people in general with a wide range of abilities. One of the things I like to say is I've gotten a little bit older, and I run my word processor at about 137%, 125%. The same feature that lets me enlarge the text a little bit lets Vishnu enlarge it a lot. And so now we can think, oh, this isn't a new feature. This is just making sure that we've thought about what it looks like at 200%, at 250%. And it's so now we're not quite as segregated. We're beginning to bring all these ideas into our discussions. I think that it's easy to talk about this in the abstract. So I want to think a little bit about how you bring this into activities. And I have a couple of different ideas that have worked for me across my career. The first is your usability or your user research. If you're not doing it, you should be in some way. We'll leave that aside. But over time, as you do research, you will build up a collection of stories for yourself or for the projects you work with. It is not as hard as you think to get people with disabilities to come in for testing. If you're at a university, and especially if you're paying a small amount as an honorarium, you can post it as a job. You can ask the Students with Disabilities Department if you can post a sign. But we have found that it's easy just to say, we welcome people with disabilities. We welcome people with low vision. We welcome people with screen readers in our notices inviting participation in the research. And we get them. So that's been lovely. So making it clear that they're invited is one way to bring people in. The other is to now begin to be a little flexible about time and location, which means that you also have to begin to look at time of day, location. Is it an easy to get to location? Is there steps? Are there public transportation? And so on. And so you can think about expanding your research skills and how you use it. I think even that moment when you're getting someone's AT set up is also a learning moment for you. What does it take to make that happen? So now we're beginning to move from more quantitative data to more qualitative data, to things that you can really learn only by interacting with an individual in pieces. So make sure that you're including people in your testing. And one of the resources in that folder is a short presentation on conducting usability testing with people using AT, especially screen readers and screen enlargers, because they just add some technical demands. The other thing is to think about, the next exercise is to think about personas in terms of features and needs. So just like you might think about what different audiences, what different market segments need in terms of of features you could put into your product. For each, you could do a team exercise where you take each of your personas or each of the personas from for everyone and think about what barriers they might encounter in the context of your project. What design features might make their experience a little better, maybe even delightful, right? So, and what's one thing or two things that really might delight them if they came into that site and saw it? It's a little old now, but the story I used to use is I have a friend who's blind, and one day she texted me and she said, "I just chose my own seat on an airplane." This was in the days when it was completely inaccessible to choose your seat. So she couldn't really book online entirely if she wanted to be able to choose a seat. And she did have seats she liked, traveled quite a bit. And so this was this moment when whatever airline it was that she first encountered that allowed her to do that was a big deal for her, a little moment of delight. Now that delight ends when everybody can do it and you have to move on to the next thing. But you're thinking about where you are now. One of the ways we do this is we love big whiteboards. Um, we use a couple of different tools to do that, is to just lay out all the personas and let people add in their own ideas in sticky notes. So we have what's on the screen is a capture of a whiteboard with some instructions about what to do, which is basically what I've just said. And then each of the photographs of our personas, and then barriers, and there's 3 to 4 sticky notes for each person, design features, a couple of sticky notes for each person, and some delight. And now you've got a really rich little mini database of discussion. Why is this a good thing or a bad thing? What can we do with it? Can it work? Who else would it work for? Are there intersections where both two or more people might be really benefit from using that feature? So it gives you a point of discussion that's not debating, do we serve this person with a disability or not? Or how do we meet this technical requirement? But really, how do we dive into understanding that person and bringing um, um, bringing that up that in front of the person. Um, the next one is to do something we call putting yourself in the persona's shoes. So let's say you're reviewing a plan or some screenshots or whatever it is in your design. You could take your team and give everybody one persona to represent and then walk through that website, let's just say, thinking about why would that person be here? What would they notice first? What's their first impression of each step in that process? What action will they take towards their own goal? And then you can review all of that, thinking about who's getting through this step in the process or this first screen or this piece of content easily, and who's encountering barriers and who's maybe delighted. And then you can continue to iterate that through, you continue to do that exercise every time you bring in something new. And you're now beginning to think about disability really early. Maybe the programmer says, I don't know how to program that. Let's go figure it out. Or you have a debate about whether serving one disability need might be a barrier for another. And you can begin to have those rich discussions. And again, we do this on the whiteboard often. We'll either put up a big picture of a screen. This shows a picture of an official Inyo County election site with a bunch of stickies on it. Some are green and some are red. Obviously, the green ones, the light green ones are the good things, and the dark sort of strawberry color are the things that are problems we want to work on. And we can now begin to collect where we want to, what do we want to do for the next round of things, or what changes do we want to make? So I see a long note in the chat, which I'm going to take a look at and invite all of you to have any comments about this section before we move to the next.
Whitney, it's Mindy. There is a comment in the chat, and Jamie would like to know. It says you've been using quantitative data, but wonders how adding some qualitative data might make this richer.
There's no question that I am a qualitative data person, and there's no question that what you want is the persona should be largely based on understanding and meeting people. So um, I think that invisible disabilities and chronic illness are some of the most difficult to represent in personas and probably need the most work because the minute you make a choice of what kind of chronic condition it is, you've begun to narrow the perspective. So I think your point is absolutely right. Actually, I have a story about that from when I was working at National Cancer Institute. We were working on personas for the website, and we had not done much research with researchers, with cancer researchers. So we just had one cancer researcher there. And as we reviewed it with many members of the institute, the person in charge of the researcher section of the website and said, well, researchers aren't just one person. There are a lot of them. They're very different on many dimensions. And we said, we know, but we don't know what they are. And we would love to work with your department to do research with researchers with a goal of understanding them. And a year later, we got the funding to do it. So it can happen. Might not happen immediately. Is there something else?
There is, yes. There are two other questions in the chat. One is, what's the best way to create personas with access needs if you don't have the lived experience in terms of accurate representation?
This is essentially the same question said from a different way, right? Which is, I think you do the best you can, and then you do research. We had I was an advisor on a project that I thought was lovely, looking at people with aphasia, and they had really wonderful, wonderful research work. And I asked them how they did it, and they said, well, for the first semester, while we were doing our background research, we volunteered at a center, and we spent a couple of afternoons there a week, meeting people, working with people, building up a rapport, so that when we were ready to come back and say we have some ideas about what our project could be, they already knew us and we already knew them. So I think you can never lived experience trumps everything. And it's your lived experience as a designer or product person just as much as it's the lived experience of the person with a disability.
And another question, when translating real world experiences into personas, how do you decide what details are essential and what might unintentionally reinforce assumptions or stereotypes? This person pointed out that it might not be related, but it reminds them of the recent discussion around the new autistic Barbie.
Yep. Also a problem, but I think it's a problem for every persona you make, right? Because every persona is going to pick and choose some details. And we'll talk next about how you choose personas for a project. But this is why we spent some time with the book, actually vetting it with people who were and or worked with people with each of the disabilities. Okay, let's move on before we run out of time. How do you choose personas for a project? Well, as you've seen, it's not a persona. Personas don't stand alone. They, as a group, kind of define boundaries within which you're designing. When I was first using them, I don't remember who it was. I've long lost the slides if I ever had them, but a speaker at a conference I was attending said, personas aren't just a collection of possible users. They define the boundaries of the design challenges inherent in your project. Right? So you're really, when you make personas, you're also thinking about the scope of the kinds of activities that your project or your product enables. Because we don't need, a person with blonde hair and a person with red hair and a person with brown hair, unless maybe, of course, our product is hair color, in which case we might want to start with different colors and how the dye affects these different hair colors. But so thinking about which differences make a difference and which differences might push your design in one direction or another. So when we think, obviously that means we start with the audience. So what defines your audience and what doesn't, right? Is it students at your university, people who shop for pet supplies? I mean, is it around a particular small behavior or is it around a larger thing? I think the more specific it is, the easier it probably is to figure out your personas. The more broad and general, the harder it is. And what goals or tasks do they expect to accomplish? What are they doing? Why are they coming to your project? Are they learning about something? Are they doing something? Are they going to participate, or are they just going to interact on a kind of one-on-one basis? Are they going to hear once or many times over time? You know, are they, is it transactional or is it interactional or is it relational? So what kinds of things are you going to build up? If you're thinking about a more relational tool, then you're going to want to think about communication styles and communication needs. If you're thinking about transactions, you've got another set of concerns. And then, as we've talked about, what kind of needs, attitudes, or preferences they begin. I've spent a lot of my time working in government, and one of the thinking about how we communicate with voters when there's a problem, right? Because we think, oh, we're doing this good thing. We're notifying voters that there's a problem and they can fix it, and that's wonderful. But here's what voters think. Oh my God, oh my God, my God, my God, oh my God, I just got a letter from the election office. Have I done something bad? Right? Or think about the difference between, you know, your neighborhood community center and the IRS, right? Those are very different relationships. And you want to think about people who have different relationships with the larger entity behind your work and so on. So that's one of the places to start. Another one is I do like to ground personas in data, not as a way of saying larger audiences are more important than smaller audiences, but to understand things like, is this largely something that affects older people, younger people? Is it common or not common? What are the relationships? Because you might think, oh, here's three very uncommon disability types, but they share something. So what are the details that will help you do that? I think there are some life context statistics that go along with some of the disability statistics, like literacy, like employment. Um, the one that I have to debunk the most often is, well, of course, everyone who's blind reads Braille, right? Well, no, we know that's not true. And in fact, that Braille literacy and employment often go hand in hand, or any of a number of different things that are the common thing the stereotypes that we think of, but figuring out how to debunk them. The other one that I love is that 30% of people who are legally blind can have some usable vision. So we began thinking about how could you design something that would enable someone to use as much usable vision as they had? What would that mean? Right? For example, um, are they a group who's likely to be on the web or not likely to be on the web? Are they, you know, we know that disability has an economic dimension. Um, Understanding the assistive technologies and when they are general purpose software or tools that are being used for disability versus when it is specialized. So how common is it? How likely it is that other people might be using it? I think one of the big things that have happened in the 10 years since we wrote these personas is the number of people, for instance, who say they watch Netflix with their captions on, or any video online with captions on. That those are being baked into things for all sorts of reasons that are not about medical disability, but situational disability. Um, and then what we look for is all kinds of experience details that are a richer picture that gives us a better sense of that life for the person you're representing. Stephen, who's the deaf graphic artist, he says, my only disability is the rest of you don't sign. Right? Something that I've heard a couple of people say to me in person. So, and that we read in some of the literature. Then you need to think about how you're going to define the design space with the personas. And there are four basics that I see and have used. One is for a strongly defined system, you might have a strong primary persona and then a few secondary personas. One of the classic examples of this might be registering for classes. The vast majority of the users are going to be students registering for classes. But you've got the staff at the registrar's office. You probably have professors who write some of the things that go into that system as secondary users. And you want to make sure that you're balancing the needs of them. You might say it's okay if the staff has to take a couple more clicks, but it's not okay if students do. you might have a matrix based on two key characteristics. Like I was working on a payroll program, and one of the questions was, is it a large company or a small company? So if you were under 10 people, the users that we did research with said, I don't mind doing that one at a time. But in companies that tipped over that boundary, heading towards 20 or 30 people, they didn't want to have to do things one at a time. They wanted to be able to do things in batches. And then the other dimension for them was how many roles they played. Are you the business office of the small company, or are you the head of something and you've got a payroll clerk and a payments clerk and so on? So how is the clerk using this system, doing this day in and day out all day long, or is it something that they intersperse with lots of other things, or something they do once in a while? And of course, that will be true both for the system itself, but also for the task within it. So end of month closing, you do 12 times a year, but all the rest of the work you might do every day, and then a few things you'll do only at the end of the year. So thinking about that rhythm of work. The other way to divide it up is to think about a collection of people. And that's what we've really done in the book, which is that we've thought about different, in this case, but here's two other kinds of characteristics. One might be people, for instance, in the cancer world, we said we had people who were just interested in the information, connected to, but not deeply, but not engaged in work. Then we had self-helpers and caregivers, people in an immediate grouping whose lives were being touched by cancer. And then we had experts who were people who were really good at medical information in some way and often intersected through those other two groups or became, sometimes we saw people who started as self-helpers become really expert readers of cancer information. And another one in my world today might be voters. We might think about people who vote all the time and people who vote only in presidential elections or only when the issues really speak to them. And then, of course, we have people who are not yet a voter. We have candidates. We have get out the vote groups who need the information, and the press. So you can think about how each sector, each domain that you're working in gives you different ways to think about this and who you want to include. So let's go back to our folks. We looked at how much they relied on specialized technology or used general purpose tools for personalization. We asked, was their primary barrier perception, interaction, or communication? And we asked about their attitude towards digital technology. Are they embracing it, like Jacob, who's a bit of a tech nerd, or are they accepting if I have to, which is Maria, or are they a little bit resistant, like Carol, the older adult? Now, there's a bit of a whatever the word is to say that Carol, as an older adult, is resistant to technology, but this was done 15 years ago, and I'm getting older, so I'm now an older adult who's not at all resistant to technology. I'm a Jacob as an older adult, but there are going to be plenty of people who maybe did not use computers day in and out of their work. And as they retire, they have even less reason to use them. Or maybe they're getting to be technology nerds because of their grandchildren, right? So there's lots of, even within that little stereotype, there's a lot of variations to unpack. So that is, with 2 minutes to spare, all I've got. I'm going to leave this screen up because it has some QR codes and some resources. One is just the book. Also, at a site called knowaboutaccessibility.org, the personas are reproduced for free online. They used to be at the book site. Something happened to the website. They're not as well accessed there. I've also got them in the folder that I told you about. And if you're interested in elections, vote.gov is a government website that has excellent accessibility for anybody trying to learn to register to vote. And if we have 1 minute, we can do final questions.
All right, Whitney, thank you so much. This has been amazing. The last question in the Q&A, is it helpful to include factors such as race, gender, and economic access in your personas when considering barriers?
It may be. Certainly when we do personas for voting, we always include a wide variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds, just to make the point. But we also begin to think about things like Maria not only represents Spanish speaking audience, but her job includes working with people and having to translate. So we sort of amplified that. Economic situations, absolutely, depending. I mean, is a $10 book a cheap book or an expensive book? Something you'd have to think about if you were a bookseller.
All right. Well, we are almost at time. So I just want to say thank you again. As someone with fibromyalgia, I've not heard that brought up in a presentation ever in this world. So I feel seen in a whole different way. And I want to thank you for that. Very relatable. This has been a wonderful presentation. We're so appreciative that you joined us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you were here. I I do have an email address. If anybody would like to write to me, I'd be happy to talk to you.
Terrific. And we will put that email in the chat in a moment. For everyone else, thank you for joining us for this session. We'll be back in a few minutes. The next session coming up is accessibility, the skill that future proofs your tech career. So stay tuned. The next session begins in 15 minutes. Thank you, everyone.